Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Today we're talking the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon and what could have been. You know, D&D was created in 1974 by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, and it was a revolution in gaming. Nothing quite like it had ever existed, and it caught on pretty darn quickly. By the 1980s, it was doing really, really well. The game was originally created for adults, but it was making a lot of inroads into a younger audience. I was probably 11 or 12 when I first started playing in 6th grade, and I was absolutely entranced by the thing. And so since it was gaining that popularity, and especially among a younger demographic, Gary Gygax headed out west to Hollywood to get a movie and a cartoon series produced. Now, at one point, Orson Welles was attached to the movie. No. There we go. Orson Welles was attached to the movie, and so that looked pretty good. Now, ultimately, the movie didn't come through, but they did manage to produce a cartoon. And this was a smart business move. This was the early 80s, and we were seeing a lot of properties that were creating sort of the cartoon to toy line, pipeline, with both of these properties working together to be bigger than they probably would have been individually. Obviously, G.I. Joe was a really good example of this, and so was Masters of the Universe. Both are toy lines that got their start in 1982, and by 1983, they were becoming cartoons. And when the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon premiered in 1983, it was a pretty big hit. It would manage in its first 2 seasons to beat such competition as Scooby-Doo, Pac-Man, and the Lovecraftian horror that was Turbo Teen. So what's the concept here for this cartoon? Some modern-day kids at an amusement park enter the Dungeons & Dragons ride. And through the course of the ride, they are brought into this fantasy world. And this actually has some antecedents in fantasy literature, including a few books that are on Gygax's Appendix N. Paul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions comes to mind. Obviously not a child, a grown man, but he enters into this medieval romantic world as a paladin, and so you have some good bloodlines for this concept, and it was one that Gygax liked. So once they're in this world, they're introduced to Dungeon Master. There's your tie-in to the game, and Dungeon Master gives Hank, Presto, Eric, Sheila, Bobby, and Diana magic items that they have to protect from the evil of Tiamat and Venger. And in the meantime, they have to use these items to the best they can to survive in this world, and so to give them time to find a way back to their homes. And these were really good cartoon episodes for the time period and considering the target audience. You had monsters, you had adventure, and they had a lot of heart, some good life lessons for the kids who were watching and for the kids in the episodes. And maybe we kind of make fun of that stuff today, but I think that builds a bigger resonance with an audience, honestly, than just simply violence and action all the time. And from the standpoint of this 12-year-old dungeon master, cartoons had some pretty awesome ideas in them that a lot of us kids were probably trying to fold into our own games that we were playing with people. I can well remember, and this is, when my family didn't have a VCR, watching the episodes live with a pad of graph paper and trying to maybe sketch out like a dungeon that they were exploring or something like that, so I could kind of bring that into my own game. And so they had this hit cartoon. And so here's where you bring in the 1-2 punch of these 80s creative kids' properties. Time to seal the deal, time to make D&D absolutely legendary. Kids were thrilling to the adventures of Hank and Diana and crew in this fantasy world. Now they were going to be able to hold these characters in their hot little hands, because in 1983, the same year the cartoon premieres, LJN released its line of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons action figures. And it included absolutely none of the heroes and villains, at least the main heroes and villains of the cartoon. And this is really kind of a tragedy, because you had a hit cartoon show, and the toy line was really pretty damn legit. You had some good characters, good designs. Toys were well made. I happen to have one of those toys here with me. Good old Warduke on his nightmare. Good figure. And Warduke's gone on to be a very popular character over time. But overall, you lacked this synthesis of the cartoon and the toy line. And I know a lot of people complain about the cartoons just being commercials for the toys, which, first of all, so kids want toys. Kids are going to get toys. Why not make an entertaining commercial for those toys? They did toy commercials all the time. These were just longer, but they also helped guide the play of the kids. You know, so you weren't going in completely cold. And, you know, this wasn't even really started with cartoons in the 1980s. It's really Star Wars that gets this ball rolling, with the movies that were running from the late 70s into 1983, and a toy line that ran from the 70s to 1985. You see that red line on this graphic represents the cartoons, or in Star Wars' case, the movies, and the blue line, the toy line. And obviously Star Wars did try to introduce some cartoons later on with Ewoks and droids that were not, you know, terribly successful, but this sort of set the model that other companies were going to follow. You got a sort of an abortive attempt with Filmation's Black Star, which is a really cool cartoon, a lot of great ideas in it. But you had a cartoon that came, you know, that showed up in 1981, and a toy line that really didn't show up till 1983, although it did last till 85, so even then did pretty well. The cartoon was probably in reruns in places. Again, you had the toy lines of G.I. Joe and He-Man showing up in 82. They get cartoons in 1983. And those cartoons lasted a pretty good long time. And nestled right in there is Dungeons & Dragons. But it didn't quite get the success of those other properties. And you see, you would get many other, you know, attempts at this going through the 1980s. Where your biggest successes there were probably in Transformers, The Real Ghostbusters, which did surprisingly well as a cartoon in terms of longevity, and then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which probably outdid all of them when you get right down to it. And a lot of them, of course, just didn't really get going at all. You had cartoons like, well, again, like the Transformers, you know, which did, you know, pretty darn well. You know, and has lasted to this day. But then you also got the Inhumanoids, which had a little crossover into the, like, at least the G.I. Joe world, I think, with a couple side characters. You know, but with Inhumanoids, you had a pretty high price point on the big Inhumanoid characters. And actually a decent price point on the others too. That would have been a hard one to get going, but still, these are some pretty cool properties, and they found some level of success. But TSR managed to bungle the entire concept. The cartoon, while it was on for 3 seasons, and again won its time slot in '83 and '84, it only got 27 episodes. And it was canceled before it got a finale. For comparison's sake, you got 60 episodes each of GoBots, Jace and the Wheeled Warriors, Masks, Centurions, none of which were massive successes on the level of, say, G.I. Joe and Transformers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but they all managed to do better than Dungeons & Dragons in terms of how many episodes they got. Now, in all fairness, a few characters that appeared in the cartoon were also in the toy line. I think it was going from the toy line over to the cartoon. In episode 4, we get Kelek, the evil magic user. In episode 5, we get the famous Warduke. There you can see him with some bullywugs. In episode 8, you got Strongheart the Paladin, although he was wielding a golden hammer instead of a sword. So there was clearly some collaboration there, but not enough. It would be like, the G.I. Joe toy line, not having like, I don't know, Snake Eyes, Duke, Scarlet in the toy line, but having, I don't know, some other random characters who would maybe show up once in the cartoon, and that was it. Because after '83, you don't get any more of that collaboration. Now, the cartoon did borrow pretty heavily from the D&D game. Orcs, Bullywugs, Tiamat, Shadow Demon. You got the Barbarian, Cavalier, and Acrobat classes all coming in from Unearthed Arcana. But that borrowing seems to have only been one way. TSR did incorporate some elements from the toy line into their game line. Notably the generally unloved Quest for the Heartstone module, and you got some NPC stats for the toy line characters, also in Shady Dragon Inn. But that was really it. That was about as far as they went. The cartoon series also got a little merchandise. There was a board game. There were some adventure books, but nothing went from cartoon to game line. Despite the fact that all of us who were playing the games wanted Hank's, magic bow to show up somewhere in a module or in a dungeon or something for us to be able to use. And so you have a company with a popular game line, a popular cartoon, a popular toy line, and almost no interaction between the three of them. So at this critical moment when Dungeons & Dragons was on the verge of becoming huge, bigger than it had ever been, doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Why not? What was the problem here? Well, this is where corporate drama enters the picture. Leadership at TSR was sort of a mess, and this is probably because you had folks who were maybe smaller businessmen or creative types suddenly creating this really wonderful game that becomes extremely popular. And sadly, they're not really prepared to run the company that was formed on the bones of this game. I mean, by the 80s, you have multiple rule books, you have modules, you have Dragon Magazine. I think they're starting maybe to get into the books and things, at least probably the Endless Quest books. It was becoming a pretty big enterprise. I think they in 1 year they made about $30 million. This is in the early 80s, so that's not chump change by any means. But the people doing it weren't necessarily up to the task. They weren't seasoned corporate executives. Ultimately, Gygax's business partners, the Blooms, got controlling interest in the company. And there was some acrimony there. And frankly, they wanted him as far away from Wisconsin as they could get him. And so they split TSR Hobbies into TSR Incorporated and TSR Entertainment Incorporated. Gary is put in charge of TSR Entertainment, and they send him off to California. Swimming pools and movie stars. But don't feel too bad about Gary, because he'd done a little bit of screwing in his day, too, in terms of his co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons. You remember Dave Arneson. And he had a pretty wild time in Hollywood to boot. And he did ultimately get a pretty cool cartoon series made, if nothing else. But there was big money at play in Dungeons & Dragons, and the knives were out. And there were some pretty big egos in there. And so it appears that this division splits entertainment from the licensing side. And that's not a good way to go. It's a bad idea at the best of times. But it's absolutely deadly when the two divisions are probably not on the best terms and not talking. And then in 1985, you get the so-called satanic panic that suddenly makes the D&D brand a little bit less palatable for children, although I must admit, none of my friends had a problem with that with their parents. It definitely hurt some folks out there who love the game. I don't know if it by itself was a big enough deal to completely derail Dungeons & Dragons, because the popularity of the game lines really doesn't start to suffer until the 90s. So it was an issue, but it wasn't the issue. And I think if the cartoon and toy line had become more popular overall, it wouldn't have really had much of an impact. I think there would have been enough money there to make the satanic panic go away, which maybe is a sad thing after all. But ultimately, you had a house divided. Two great creative properties, but not supporting one another. Mob of angry moms is at the castle gates, and that meant D&D was not going to take its place with G.I. Joe, He-Man, the Transformers, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as a truly massive property of the 1980s. And instead, sort of went up in smoke. And I've mentioned a few times on this channel that one should not judge the creative quality of a property by how well it does financially. There are movies and TV shows, toy lines and cartoons, comic books that were quite good despite not getting a massive audience. And sometimes they really are derailed by bad timing or by corporate mismanagement. And I think in the case of Dungeons & Dragons, corporate, we'll call it mismanagement, it played a really big part. In the case of D&D, to put it in terms gamers will understand, TSR split the party and as a result suffered a TPK. So what do you remember about Dungeons & Dragons, the cartoon? Remember about the toys? Did you have them? Did you love them? Did you want to see them last a little bit longer? Was your D&D experience derailed by the satanic panic? By mazes and monsters? Thanks a lot, Tom Hanks. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video and the tale of woe that surrounds the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, please give it a like. That helps me with the algorithm. Maybe think about subscribing to this channel where I talk about a lot of different pop culture from the past and a few indie bits from the current days. And maybe share with a friend who you think might enjoy it. In the meantime, God bless every single one of you. Be kind to one another. and try to have some fun. And I will see you the next time around in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye now.